On the weekend of the assassination, I discussed this with my then brother-in-law, Harold Feldman, who wrote on this matter. And we talked about Oswald, the alleged assassin. And we said that one had to maintain an open mind on the issue of whether or not he was the assassin and whether or not there was a conspiracy. But that open mind would have to close if during the course of the weekend Oswald was killed. When Oswald was killed, both of us decided that this was a matter which could not be entrusted to the government, that the investigation of it would have to be undertaken by private individuals.
That's a guy named Vincent Salandria, who was one of the most influential of the early JFK conspiracy theorists. Salandria is speaking there in 1994, and he's recalling the sequence of events that led him to suspect, or in fact conclude, that there must have been a conspiracy behind Kennedy's murder. Salandria was ready to keep an open mind for 2 days, but when Oswald was shot dead in police custody, Salandria's open mind, in his own words, had to close. This sounds like a dangerously candid admission to make. All conspiracy theorists have closed minds, but they very rarely admit that, or even realise it. And to be fair to Salandria, he didn't exactly mean to say what he seemed to say there. What he meant to say was that when Ruby shot Oswald in police custody, it no longer seemed wise to just sit back and let the authorities handle the investigation by themselves. That's the thing you had to close your mind to. The idea that the government could be trusted to tell the truth about the assassination. Independent investigation was going to be required. That's what Salandria meant, but unfortunately I think his talk about closing his mind was far more revealing than he meant it to be. When people decide that they need to conduct independent research about things like assassinations, their minds always do seem to close to the possibility that the government's version of events might be true. You see this today in people who set out to do their own research on vaccines or epidemics. These people very rarely, in fact almost never, end up discovering that what the medical authorities have said all along is spot on. To prove that they have independent minds, it seems to be almost mandatory for these independent researchers to reach independent conclusions. Research of this kind always seems to have a far more political or even religious flavour than a rational one. Instead of being guided by the evidence, it's guided by a powerful unconscious incentive to avoid reaching the same conclusion that everybody else has already reached. This dynamic certainly applies in the Kennedy case, where the phrase independent researcher is almost a synonym for conspiracy theorist. When Vincent Salandria said that his mind closed when Jack Ruby shot Oswald, he accidentally hit the nail on the head about a process that didn't just go on in his mind on the weekend after Kennedy's assassination, but in hundreds of thousands of other minds too. When Ruby shot Oswald, people's minds closed like a fist around the suspicion of conspiracy. They didn't even wait to find out who Ruby was. Their mental drawbridges went up, and in many cases they just never came back down again, no matter how flimsy the evidence of conspiracy turned out to be. People can hardly be blamed for reaching hasty conclusions about Oswald's shooting in the heat of the moment, but the fact that people reacted irrationally at the time of the shooting is no excuse to be still thinking that way now, 60 years after the event. As we saw in the previous episode, the more you know about who Jack Ruby was and the closer you look at his movements on the day he shot Oswald, the clearer it becomes that his crime was motivated by personal whim and was made possible by a series of lucky or unlucky accidents. By the end of the last episode, the idea that Ruby was some kind of conspiratorial hitman was hanging by a thread. In this episode, we're going to return to that thread and we're going to see if it can hold. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. Last time on the podcast, I tried to argue that the question of how Jack Ruby shot Oswald is in a sense more important than the question of why he shot him, and in fact goes a long way to answering that question too. In other words, the nuts and bolts, minute-by-minute story of how Ruby made his way to the crime scene that morning, and how he arrived in position with no more than 5 seconds to spare, tells us almost all we need to know about how realistic the idea of a Ruby conspiracy is. A few episodes back, I mentioned the American professor John McAdams, who had a very useful 2-word hack that he used to combat conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination. What McAdams used to say was, think scenario, or as he would have pronounced it, think scenario. What he meant was, it isn't enough for conspiracy theorists to just loudly claim that a conspiracy occurred in this case. If they're so sure that there was one, the onus is on them to give us an exact description of the scenario they believe in and to show us how well it fits in with the hard evidence. When it comes to Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald, the think scenario hack is useful to us in 2 ways. It's useful in a broad sense because it encourages us to ask ourselves exactly what kind of cockamamie conspiracy would have used Jack Ruby as a trigger man. And it also encourages us to think about exactly how any conspiracy involving Ruby would have had to work in a logistical, play-by-play sense. We know an awful lot about Ruby's movements on the morning he shot Oswald. We know that those movements at least appear to have been very chancy and impulsive. We can't just wish away the facts of Ruby's movements on that morning. If there was a conspiracy, it somehow has to be mapped onto those facts. And the number of thinkable conspiratorial scenarios that can be mapped onto those facts is very, very limited. In fact, the number gets closer and closer to 0 the more you think about it. But before we start thinking about the finer points of those scenarios, it has to be said that in a broad sense, the idea of any conspiratorial scenario involving Jack Ruby does seem to be self-evidently absurd. If you know nothing about Ruby except that he shot Oswald in police custody, the idea that he was some kind of shadowy, mobbed-up trigger man does sound fairly promising. But Ruby was a real man with a real personality of his own, and we saw in the previous episode what that personality was like. Ruby was a grotesque blabbermouth with a vastly inflated sense of self-importance. The idea that any group of sophisticated conspirators would have handpicked Jack Ruby to eliminate the president's assassin is laughable. If Ruby had been given that job, he would have been broadcasting that information from the rooftops well before the shooting, let alone after it. Sending in Jack Ruby to shut somebody's mouth would be like if a party was threatening to get out of hand and you sent in Fred Durst to calm things down. One of the strange paradoxes of conspiracy theory is that on one hand it believes that secret societies like the CIA and the Mafia are far more powerful and all-knowing than they really are. And yet at the same time, it's also capable of believing that when one of these superhuman agencies decided that Oswald had to be rubbed out, it chose a florid clown like Jack Ruby to carry out the assignment. The biggest irony of the Ruby as hitman scenario is that Ruby, by any measure, was a far more volatile and unreliable person than Oswald was. Imagine you were running a conspiracy and you had to choose which guy out of Oswald and Ruby would be more likely to keep his mouth shut. Obviously, you'd choose Oswald every day of the week. Oswald was a consummate liar and keeper of secrets, as we've seen in the early episodes of this podcast. The idea that you would need to send in anybody to silence him is close to redundant, and the idea that you'd send in Jack Ruby to silence him is beyond redundant. It's ridiculous, because that would only leave you with a second guy in custody who was far more likely to spill his guts than the first guy had been. So that's what happens when we try to think scenario about Ruby in a broad sense. But what happens when we take the mantra further and apply it to the physical facts of his crime? In the last episode, we looked at Ruby's movements on the morning he shot Oswald, and we saw that there wasn't the smallest sign in them that Ruby coordinated his actions with any other person, or that he was acting on anybody else's behalf. On the contrary, we saw that his actions reeked of last-minute impulsiveness and improvisation. To give a brief recap of what happened that morning, although Oswald was scheduled to be moved from City Hall to the county jail at 10 a.m, Ruby didn't leave his apartment till around 11. He then went to the Western Union office, a block away from City Hall, to wire a $25 loan to one of his strippers, whose stage name was Little Lynn. Ruby's money order was time-stamped at 11:17 a.m. He shot Oswald 4 minutes later at 11:21 in the City Hall parking garage. Ruby reached the spot he shot Oswald from only 5 seconds before pulling the trigger. If there had been just one more person lined up at the counter at the Western Union, Ruby would have missed what conspiracy theorists somehow managed to think of as his assignment. Conspiracy theorists are fond of pointing out that Ruby's work as a nightclub operator brought him into contact with various unsavoury members of the organised crime community. To the conspiracy theorists, this means that elements of that community must therefore have been involved in Oswald's murder. Unfortunately, though, one thing we do know about organised crime is that it's organised. And Ruby's movements in the minutes leading up to Oswald's shooting were the opposite of organised. His so-called hit came within 5 seconds of being a miss. If Ruby had been acting on behalf of the mob or some other autonomous agency, then obviously he would have turned up in the parking garage at or before Oswald's advertised transfer time of 10 a.m. The fact that he didn't turn up till 11:21 doesn't entirely rule out the idea of a Ruby conspiracy, but it does mean that if Ruby was involved in a conspiracy, it can't have been a simple one-agency affair. Ruby had to have had at least one accomplice inside the Dallas Police Department as well, who let him know that Oswald's transfer wasn't going to take place at the advertised time. But how would that inside man scenario have worked in practice? The simplest way would have been if the inside man knew in advance that Oswald's transfer was going to happen at exactly 11:21 and told Ruby to be in position by that time. But we know that this can't have happened because Ruby's movements that morning just weren't the movements of a man who was conscious of a pressing need to arrive in the parking garage before that deadline. If he knew that his window of opportunity was going to open and close at exactly 11:21, he obviously wouldn't have still been dicking around in the Western Union office at 11:17. What about the possibility that Ruby's hypothetical inside man gave him regular updates about Oswald's delayed transfer as the morning went on, so that Ruby was able to time his arrival in the parking garage perfectly without ever appearing to be in any kind of rush? That scenario is even less thinkable than the other one, because there's simply no mechanism by which Ruby could have been kept posted about Oswald's movements in real time. There were, of course, no cell phones in those days, so the scope for coordinating this kind of operation by telephone would have been very limited. There's no evidence that Ruby received or placed any phone calls at his apartment that morning, apart from the call he received from Little Lynn and an earlier call that he received from his cleaning lady. More to the point, there's no evidence that he placed or received any last-minute phone call at the Western Union office, which he would have had to do in order to time his arrival at the other end of the block so perfectly. And nobody noticed any rogue cops up on the roof of City Hall that morning waving semaphore flags or sending up smoke signals. Really, there's only one scenario left that might keep the idea of a Ruby conspiracy in play. Somebody inside the Dallas Police Department must have deliberately held back Oswald's transfer until it was clear that Ruby was in place, or was very nearly in place. In practice, this would have been wickedly hard to pull off. Realistically, it would have needed the participation of not just one man in the Dallas Police Department, but quite a few. And at least one of these inside men must have been very high-ranking. He had to have been part of the inner circle that had control over the timing of Oswald's departure. In fact, if there was any such conspiracy, one man who quite certainly had to have been in on it was Captain Fritz of the Homicide Bureau. Fritz was the man who was running Oswald's interrogation that morning, and he alone had the authority to decide when it was over. So how realistic is the idea of a Captain Fritz conspiracy? Before we go into that question, I want to make a general observation about how conspiracy theory works. Notice how the general likelihood of a Ruby conspiracy keeps shrinking as we test it against the facts. And notice that instead of taking that as a sign that they should give up, conspiracy theorists respond by adding more and more imaginary conspirators to the mix. To keep the idea of a Ruby conspiracy in play, it isn't enough to imagine that he conspired with a few low-level mafiosi or with some rogue members of the CIA. You have to bring the Dallas Police Department into the mix too. And not just any old member of the Dallas Police Department either. You have to believe that Ruby was in cahoots with the captain of homicide himself. Instead of whittling itself down to fit the facts, the conspiratorial hypothesis keeps getting more and more bloated and far-fetched all the time. And this always seems to happen with conspiracy theory. The conspiracies that it imagines are never low-level, small potato affairs. They're always total conspiracies. They're conspiracies that go all the way to the top. Until this point in the podcast, I've resisted mentioning the concept of Occam's razor, but this feels like the right moment to bring it in. Occam's razor was invented in the 14th century by an English monk called William of Ockham, and it's another useful hack for thinking accurately about the world. Ockham argued that if we want to understand a given phenomenon correctly, the simplest explanation will generally be the best. And the simplest explanation is the one that requires us to make the smallest number of assumptions. That's why we call Occam's razor a razor, because it slashes away superfluous assumptions. The way that Occam himself put this was, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. It sounds a bit abstract, but really we use Occam's razor every day without knowing it, because our common sense intuitions are hardwired to slash away needless assumptions automatically. If you walk into your kitchen and there's half a donut sitting on your counter and your 2-year-old child is standing there with a ring of donut residue around his mouth, you know immediately that he's eaten half the donut. You don't waste any time wondering if an intruder has broken into the house, eaten half the donut, and smeared some frosting round your kid's mouth to frame him. That scenario may be technically possible, but unless you live in a pretty messed up neighbourhood, it isn't seriously thinkable. In the case of Oswald's murder, the simplest explanation is that Jack Ruby acted alone. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider other possibilities, but if those other possibilities don't pan out, the explanation that Ruby did it alone is always there, and it's a perfectly good and sufficient explanation. But for conspiracy theorists, that explanation is taboo. It's completely unacceptable, and they'll say anything to stop us from seeing that it's valid and almost certainly true. They do the complete opposite of what William of Ockham told us to do. Their goal is to reject the simplest explanation. Instead of keeping theoretical assumptions to a minimum, they throw assumption after assumption onto the fire. And the assumptions they make are needless assumptions in Occam's terms. They're not assumptions that we need to make in order to make sense of the evidence. They're assumptions that conspiracy theorists need to make to keep the dream of conspiracy alive. I've repeatedly said in this podcast that real conspiracies do occur, and there's nothing wrong with exploring the possibility that a conspiracy occurred in this case, as long as you do it using rational methods. But conspiracy theorists do it using irrational methods. And that's what's wrong with conspiracy theory. It doesn't set out to understand the truth, it sets out to prove conspiracy. And it doesn't care how many crazy and needless assumptions it has to make to keep that idea alive. It's the complete opposite of a rational inquiry, in other words. That's what conspiracy theory is, and that's why it's a problem. Assuming, of course, that we agree that being irrational and refusing to accept the truth is a problem. So how rational is the idea that elements of the Dallas Police Department, spearheaded by Captain J.W. Fritz, delayed Oswald's appearance that morning until Jack Ruby was in position to shoot him? Even at a glance, this idea has one obvious defect. If the conspiracy to murder Oswald involved the Dallas Police Department at such a high level, then what would have been the point of involving Jack Ruby at all? Why didn't the cops just kill Oswald in his cell, away from all the microphones and cameras, and make it look like suicide? Why bring in the wild card of Jack Ruby? Adding Ruby to the mix would have been pointlessly risky. It would have been superfluous. This problem of redundancy always seems to come up when you try to think through any conspiratorial scenario involving Ruby. If Oswald and Ruby were brought together that day by a conspiracy rather than by accident, the conspiracy had to be a pretty extensive one. But the more people you insert into the conspiracy, the more pointless and dispensable Jack Ruby starts to look. And yet Ruby did shoot Oswald. That's one hard fact that we all have to deal with, even if you sometimes get the feeling that conspiracy theorists would prefer to forget it. Their theories about Oswald's death would make so much more sense if only Ruby wasn't clownishly stuck there in the middle of the picture. He does kind of lower the tone and ruin the vibe of the super sophisticated, all-knowing conspiracy. To look deeper into the claim that Oswald's transfer was deliberately delayed for Ruby's benefit, we need to switch our attention from Ruby's side of the story to Oswald's. We've seen how Ruby came to be standing within a foot of Oswald at 11:21 that morning, but how did Oswald come to be standing within a foot of Ruby? To find out, we need to rewind the tape of Oswald's morning and see if there was anything suspicious about the way that he came to be in that spot at exactly the right or wrong moment. Is it possible that somebody controlled Oswald's movements to make that happen? Or does Oswald's side of the story, like Ruby's, look like a series of unlucky accidents when you zoom in on it? One way of starting to answer those questions is to look at the story of a man named Harry D. Holmes, who was a key player in the events of that morning. Holmes was a postal inspector who worked in the Dallas branch of the US Post Office. On the afternoon of Kennedy's assassination, the FBI called Holmes in to help out with the mail-related aspects of its investigation. Holmes helped to identify the various post office boxes that Oswald had rented, and he followed the paper trail that Oswald had left behind when purchasing his mail-order pistol and rifle. As well as assisting the FBI, Holmes had also been working with Captain Fritz at police headquarters. As Holmes put it later, he was, quote, in and out of Captain Fritz's office on numerous occasions during the 2-day period between the murder of Kennedy and the murder of Oswald. On the Sunday morning, the morning of Oswald's death, Harry Holmes wasn't scheduled to do any further work on the investigation, so he and his wife set out on their regular trip to church. But when they got to the chapel, it suddenly occurred to Holmes that Fritz and his team must be getting pretty exhausted down at City Hall and could maybe use an extra hand. So Holmes's wife went into the church by herself, and Holmes drove to City Hall to see if he could be of any further use. He arrived at about 9:30 a.m, and Captain Fritz invited him into his office to help out with Oswald's final interrogation. Holmes was happy to do that because he still had a few questions that he wanted Oswald to clear up for him. When Holmes first walked into the room, Oswald was hostile to him because he took him for an FBI agent. But when Holmes identified himself as a postal inspector, Oswald simmered down and answered his questions, although it goes without saying that he didn't answer all of them honestly. For example, he continued to deny that he'd ever used the name A.J. Hirdell, and he denied that he'd ever owned or mail-ordered any rifle. Harry Holmes's involvement in Oswald's interrogation made it run much longer than it otherwise would have. Oswald's scheduled transfer time of 10 a.m. came and went, and as the interrogation dragged on, the cops in the hallway outside Fritz's office, including Chief Curry, started banging on the door and sticking their heads into the room. They were getting impatient, Holmes said later. They wanted to go ahead and complete the transfer. So if Harry Holmes hadn't made his snap decision not to go to church that morning, it seems clear that Oswald's transfer would have happened well before 11:21 a.m. If it wasn't for Holmes, Oswald would have been out of City Hall and safely ensconced in the county jail, while Jack Ruby was still sitting around his apartment in his undies. Conspiracy theorists have an answer for that, of course. They'll tell you that Harry Holmes was part of the conspiracy too, and that his story about suddenly deciding not to go to church that morning was an obvious lie. Either that, or they'll tell you that Holmes was an unwitting pawn in Captain Fritz's game, and that the wily Fritz was only too happy to let Holmes drone on with questions about post office boxes, while Jack Ruby was tortuously making his way to the scene of the prearranged crime. Unfortunately, though, we're about to hit another one of those stubborn facts in this story that no conspiracy theorist has ever been able to budge or deal with. Shortly after 11 a.m, Harry Holmes ran out of questions for Oswald, and the interrogation was finally over. It's hard to say exactly what time it was when this happened, but it was somewhere around 11:10 a.m. That is pretty much the same time that Jack Ruby was entering the Western Union office at the far end of the block. If Oswald had been led straight down to the parking garage at this point, Ruby wouldn't have got within a bull's roar of being able to shoot him. But when Oswald's interrogation ended, something interesting happened. Oswald himself caused a further delay in proceedings by asking for a change of clothes. He was dressed in trousers and a t-shirt, and he wanted to put something else on over the t-shirt before he got moved. Shortly after his arrest, a selection of Oswald's clothes had been confiscated from his apartment and brought down to City Hall. So a detective now stepped out of Fritz's office and went to fetch these items. He came back a minute or two later, carrying Oswald's impounded clothes on a couple of hangers. Oswald picked out a collared shirt and asked for one of his sweaters. When he was handed a sweater he didn't want, he handed it back and said, "Give me the black one." Oswald's handcuffs were removed so that he could put on the collared shirt and the sweater. His hands were then recuffed in front of him, and his right wrist was attached by a second set of cuffs to the left wrist of Detective Jim Lavelle, who was the big guy in the pale suit and the white cowboy hat that you see in photos and footage of Oswald's shooting. It's impossible to say how much time it took to cater to Oswald's last-minute sartorial demands, but it obviously took way longer than 10 seconds, which means that Jack Ruby would never have made it into position in time to shoot him if Oswald himself hadn't spent so much time fannying about over his wardrobe. The great Vincent Bugliosi, in his book Reclaiming History, sums up this whole episode by saying, unless Oswald was a party to the conspiracy to murder himself, it would appear from this fact alone that Ruby's killing of Oswald at 11:21 a.m. was not a planned event. There are times in the Kennedy assassination story when you want to say to the conspiracy theorists, why don't you just give up? Why don't you throw in the towel and admit that your suspicions about this case have just never panned out? The idea that Ruby was involved in some kind of conspiracy to murder Oswald did look kind of plausible to begin with, but the closer you look at it, the more problematic it seems, until finally you arrive at the absurd discovery that Ruby would have missed his shot at Oswald altogether if Oswald hadn't insisted on wearing his precious black sweater. The last shreds of the Ruby as hitman scenario finally disappear in a puff of logic at this point. And if there was no conspiracy to kill Oswald, the notion that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy starts to vanish too. But there are two kinds of conspiracy believers in the Kennedy case. There are those who don't know any of the above stuff and who are capable of changing their minds when you tell them about it. But there's a harder core of conspiracy theorists who are perfectly aware of all this stuff and just aren't bothered by it. They know that Ruby was still in the Western Union office at 11:17 a.m. They know that he brought his favourite dog along with him that morning and left her in his car. They know about Harry Holmes and about Oswald's last-minute request for a sweater. They know all of that stuff, and yet they still believe there was a conspiracy. That may sound quite perverse of them, but if we're going to understand how conspiracy theory works, we need to rid ourselves pretty quickly of the idea that you can stop it just by pointing out that it's absurd. The historian Richard Hofstadter once said something great about the American conspiratorial style. He said that for thinkers of this kind, the unbelievable is the only thing that can be believed. Or to give you a fuller version of Hofstadter's quote, he said, "One should not be misled by the fantastic conclusions that are so characteristic of this political style into imagining that it is not, so to speak, argued out along factual lines. The very fantastic character of its conclusions leads to heroic strivings for evidence to prove that the unbelievable is the only thing that can be believed." Conspiracy theorists love a challenge, is what Hofstadter was basically saying there. Anyone can believe the obvious. Believing the unbelievable is much harder. It takes real effort. It requires you to commit yourself to an argument that will never end. You can't throw a conspiracy theorist by demonstrating that their conclusions are absurd, because part of the very point of being a conspiracy theorist is to show people that you're mentally daring enough to believe in absurdities. You can believe things that boring, unimaginative, normal people don't believe. To paraphrase what Jack Kennedy himself said about putting a man on the moon, conspiracy theorists believe the things they believe not because they're easy to believe, but because they're hard to believe. So if Jack Ruby wasn't a hitman, why did he do it? I think we've reached the point now where we can see that this isn't a rhetorical question. It's a real question that needs a real answer. Ruby was not a hitman, so he must have had some other reason for shooting Oswald. I think he had several reasons, and I pointed to a couple of them in the previous episode. I mentioned the tear-jerking letter that Ruby read in the newspaper on the morning he shot Oswald, the Dear Caroline letter addressed to President Kennedy's 5-year-old daughter. And I mentioned the related fact that Ruby thought he would be hailed as a hero when he shot Oswald and didn't think he'd spend even a night in jail. I also quoted Ruby's famous claim that he wanted to show the world, quote, that a Jew had guts. Ruby made this claim on several different occasions in several different forms. On another occasion he said, "I wanted to show my love for our faith. Being of the Jewish faith, I wanted to show that we love our president, even though we are not of the same faith." So those are some of the things that Ruby said about his motives, but it also seems possible that Ruby had other, deeper motives that he never talked about, and perhaps wasn't even consciously aware of.
Is he married? No, he never has been, to my knowledge. It seems that he mentioned to me before he's never married.
That's a guy named Bill DeMar, speaking shortly after Ruby shot Oswald. DeMar was a comedian and ventriloquist who used to perform at Ruby's Carousel Club, and the suggestion that he's dancing around there is the suggestion that Jack Ruby was gay. A lot of people around Ruby thought that he might be. As we've seen, Ruby lived with a male roommate named George Senator, whom Ruby would sometimes jokingly refer to as his boyfriend. We'll never know for sure if Ruby was gay, and in a sense it doesn't matter, but the fact that he was widely believed to be gay in Texas in 1963 certainly does matter, because it might well have played into Ruby's general need to prove himself. Ruby was well aware that people gossiped about his sexuality, and the fact clearly bothered him. The famous Little Lynn, the stripper that Ruby wired the money to on the morning of Oswald's murder, later said of Ruby, quote, "He was always asking the question, 'Do you think I am a queer? Do you think I look like a queer? Or have you ever known a queer to look like me?' Every time I saw him, he would ask it. He would say, 'Do you think I look like one or act like one?'" Ruby used to boast to his male friends that there was no stripper or waitress at his club that he hadn't had sex with. But from the sound of her testimony, Little Lynn was one female employee that Ruby hadn't even tried to unleash his supposedly rampant heterosexuality on. And it seems a fair bet that she wasn't the only one. When Ruby talked about his sexuality or his alleged heterosexual conquests, there was always a strong flavour of insecurity or of protesting too much in what he said. The theme always seemed to be on his mind, so it doesn't seem unreasonable to suppose that it was at least partly on his mind when he shot Oswald. Ruby said that he wanted to show the world that a Jew had guts, but at some level he may have also wanted to show Texas that a gay man had guts. But we'll never be sure about Ruby's sexuality. All we'll ever be able to do is speculate. And anyway, his sexuality is a side issue compared with the much more central question we need to get to grips with about Ruby if we want to arrive at a full understanding of his motives. The central question about Ruby is the question of whether or not he was sane. No serious student of Ruby's life would deny that there's compelling evidence that he wasn't. Conspiracy theorists like to refer to people like me as lone nutters, as if our belief that both Oswald and Ruby acted alone is synonymous with believing that they're both nuts. But anyone who called me a lone nutter would be only 3/4 correct. I do believe that both Ruby and Oswald acted alone, but I don't believe that Oswald was in any technical sense a nut. I may have said once or twice in this podcast that he was crazy, but I wasn't trying to give a serious medical diagnosis. It would be more exact to say that Oswald was a zealot. He showed us that radical ideology can have lethal consequences if you believe in it fervently enough. But Oswald was by no means batshit insane. When he took rifle shots at famous political figures, his actions were fully premeditated and carefully thought through. He may not have been fully in control of his urges, but he was always fully in control of his actions. Ruby, on the other hand, really did put the nut into lone nut. There's ample evidence that he was batshit insane, at least by the end of his life. As we're going to see, the question with Ruby is not whether he was mad, but when did he start to go mad? Was he already unravelling when he shot Oswald, or did he only start to unravel after the event? The first serious inquiry into the question of Ruby's sanity came during his murder trial. The question was bound to come up because Ruby's lawyers could hardly dispute the fact that he had shot and killed Oswald. The main legal question the jury would have to ponder was the question of what Ruby's state of mind had been when he pulled the trigger.
He had calmed down somewhat from when I saw him yesterday in the city jail. He was still in a very emotional, nervous state. He was able to discuss some of the events leading up to the fatal shooting.
That's a Texan attorney named Tom Howard. Howard had represented Ruby a few times in the past, and he was the first lawyer Ruby hired after he shot Oswald. For a while it looked as though Howard was going to represent Ruby at his trial. Howard's defense strategy wasn't going to be too ambitious. He wouldn't set out to prove that Ruby was legally insane and therefore not guilty. Instead, he planned to argue that Ruby was guilty of a lesser offence than the one he'd been charged with. The DA had charged Ruby with having killed Oswald with malice aforethought. If the jury found him guilty of that crime, they could send him to the electric chair. Tom Howard planned to convince the jury that Ruby had committed murder without malice, that is, he'd killed Oswald in the heat of passion. Murder without malice was roughly equal to the offence that was known in most other states as manslaughter. In Texas at the time, the maximum sentence for murder without malice was 5 years in prison. It was generally believed in Dallas that Tom Howard had a pretty good murder without malice case, and that the jury was quite likely to decide that 5 years in prison was about right for what Ruby had done. Unfortunately for Tom Howard, and perhaps for Jack Ruby himself, Ruby's family decided that Howard just wasn't an experienced enough trial lawyer to handle Jack's defense alone, so they hired this guy as well.
I'm the lawyer. I'm only concerned how Jack Ruby feels. He's the client.
That's the flamboyant Californian attorney, Melvin Belli. In the late 1960s, Belli would make the national headlines once again when he became involved in the Zodiac case in San Francisco. In the Zodiac movie, Belli is played by the Scottish actor Brian Cox. In the Ruby case, Belli was played by himself, and the performance had a heavy dose of ham.
Railroad? This is a kangaroo railroad, and every one of you know it, too. Repeat this? I'll repeat this with every breath I have in me for as long as I live.
To help out with Ruby's defense, Belli brought in a Texan attorney named Joe Tonnehill. Tom Howard found himself demoted to third fiddle, and he ended up resigning from Ruby's defense team because he violently disagreed with the strategy that Melvin Belli had decided to take to trial. Belli wasn't interested in pursuing a murder without malice case. Instead, he decided to swing for the fences and argue that Ruby was not guilty by reason of insanity.
You expect to enter an insanity plea?
I think the pleas have already been entered. I haven't had a chance to look at the formal denials, but there will be a not guilty and a not guilty by reason of insanity.
Belli's insanity defense was a high-stakes gamble. If he convinced the jury that Ruby was insane at the time of the murder, then Ruby would walk out of court a free man. But if the jury didn't buy the insanity argument, they were quite likely to find that Ruby was guilty of murder with malice, and if they did, they would be free to send him to the electric chair. As well as being risky, Belli's insanity defense was completely at odds with Ruby's own sense of why he'd shot Oswald. Ruby wanted people to see him as an avenging hero, even if that meant that he would have to spend 5 years in prison. The last thing he wanted people to think was that he was out of his mind. So Ruby and his new lawyers started to clash in public about the insanity strategy. When Ruby told reporters that he wasn't crazy, his lawyers returned fire with an argument straight out of Catch-22. The fact that Ruby denied he was crazy only proved how crazy he really was.
What about Jack's reply to you that he doesn't want anything to do with you? What do you say about that?
That's a typical pattern of a man that's insane. He has these ambivalent, swinging moods. He goes from love to hate, affection to unaffection, what have you. That's typical. That's the pattern of an insane person.
You think the family...
He says, I'm sane, you're crazy, I have no problem.
That's Joe Tonnehill, the Texan lawyer that Melvin Belli brought in to work as his wingman during that trial. Belli's insanity defence would end up being a lose-lose scenario for Ruby. It made the world in general believe that he was insane, but it didn't convince the jury of that. After deliberating for a little over 2 hours, the jury found Ruby guilty of murder with malice, and they sentenced him to death. Although cameras hadn't been permitted in court during the trial, the judge did allow them into his courtroom to film the handing down of the verdict and the sentence.
About to receive the verdict in the case styled the State of Texas versus Jack Ruby. I want no sort of demonstration, no sound, no gesturing of any kind. Ladies and gentlemen, you have reached a verdict in this case. May I have it, Sheriff, please? We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death. Signed, Max E. Causey, Foreman. All right, Sheriff, he's your prisoner.
May I thank this jury for a victory for bigotry?
Keep your seats, please. There'll be no moving out. Don't let anybody out of the courtroom.
The voice you heard interjecting at the end there was Melvin Belli's. I'll play his interjection again. What you'll hear him say is, "May I thank this jury for a victory for bigotry."
May I thank this jury for a victory for bigotry?
Keep your seats, please. There'll be no moving out. Don't let anybody out.
As Ruby was being led out of the courtroom to his cell, Belli told him, "Don't you worry, Jack. We'll appeal this and take it out of Dallas." And that remark was also picked up by the microphones.
Don't you worry, Jack. We'll appeal this and take it out of Dallas.
Actually, Belli would later be vindicated on this point. Ruby's guilty verdict was subsequently appealed, and the appeal judges did overturn it, partly because they ruled that he hadn't been able to receive a fair trial in Dallas. So they ordered a retrial. But by the time Ruby's verdict was appealed, Belli was no longer part of his legal team. Ruby sacked him a few days after being found guilty, although he did retain the services of Joe Tonnehill. Unfortunately, as I briefly mentioned in the last episode, Ruby ended up dying before his case could be retried. His guilty verdict was overturned in October 1966. In December, he was diagnosed with inoperable cancer, and he died in custody in January 1967, just a month after receiving his diagnosis. Melvin Belli has copped a lot of stick over the years for his insanity defence of Ruby. People have suggested that it was a reckless strategy and that Belli was putting his own personal glory ahead of Ruby's best interests. An assistant DA who helped to prosecute Ruby, a guy named Bill Alexander, said later, "Belli took a good 5-year murder without malice case and made it into a death penalty for his client. Belli just dared that jury to give Ruby the death penalty, and they didn't like that, and they didn't like Belli either." Bill Alexander quite liked Jack Ruby, despite the fact that he was helping to prosecute him for murder, and as the trial went on, Alexander became appalled by the visible toll that it was taking on Ruby's physical and mental health. Belli put on this god-awful defence, and day by day Jack melted, Alexander said. He just looked worse and worse. He was a pitiful object by the time the trial was over. Belli was doing the exact opposite of what he wanted. He didn't mind being found guilty of killing Oswald because Oswald killed the president, but he didn't want anybody to think that he was retarded or mentally handicapped or an insane person. Whatever else you can say about him, Jack had a lot of pride." End quote. To be fair to Melvin Belli, though, he did honestly seem to think that Ruby wasn't sane. After meeting his client for the first time, Belli came away with the impression that, quote, something was mentally wrong with Ruby, and Belli continued to believe that even after the trial was over.
His conscience is clean. He's a sick man.
And Melvin Belli was far from being the only person in Ruby's life who believed that he was mentally unwell. As we saw in the last episode, everybody who knew Ruby believed that, to one degree or another. Even Henry Wade, the DA who successfully rebutted Belli's insanity defence, told the newspapers, quote, "Although Ruby is sane, there is no question that he has some neurotic tendencies that could be treated in the penitentiary." Unfortunately, the penitentiary had exactly the opposite effect on Ruby's mental health. By the time he'd been in jail for a few months, his issues went well beyond having a few neurotic tendencies. When his sister visited him in May, just 2 months after his trial, she left the jail believing that Ruby was, quote, mentally deranged. She was shocked by his physical and mental decline. He'd lost about 40 pounds and he looked emaciated. He'd recently tried to commit suicide by ramming his head against the wall of his cell. He was deeply delusional. He tried to tell his sister that his trial had been a weird kind of charade. The judge hadn't been a real judge. He'd been an imposter wearing a judge costume. Ruby believed that some parts of his trial had taken place in secret behind his back, and that during those secret hearings, false evidence had been presented that implicated Ruby in Kennedy's murder as well as Oswald's. Ruby knew what the conspiracy theorists were saying about him. He knew that they thought he'd been part of some grand conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination. And that was a bitter pill for Ruby to swallow. He'd killed Oswald to avenge Kennedy's death. Now people thought that he was somehow responsible for Kennedy's death. Sadly, Ruby took these conspiracy theories to heart. He became horribly obsessed by the fact that people were blaming him for Kennedy's murder, and he began to believe that Jewish people were being collectively punished around the world as a result. Ruby told his sister that because of his perceived involvement in the assassination, 25 million Jews had already been slaughtered around the world, which incidentally was more than twice as many Jewish people as there really were in the world at that time. Ruby believed that many of these mass murders had been committed in the Dallas County Jail on the floor below his cell. He claimed that at night he could hear the screams of Jews being boiled alive in oil. He believed that planes were flying over America, dropping bombs on his people from above. Ruby urged his sister to kill herself to avoid the tortures that awaited her. He had hallucinations in which he saw his brother and his brother's children having their limbs cut off. Ruby's sister had to keep reassuring him that all of his relatives were in fact still alive and unharmed. The delusions that plagued Jack Ruby in his jail cell were terrible and ugly, but we do need to remember that his paranoia had a context. In 1964, it was only 2 decades since the Nazis had systematically tried to exterminate the Jews of Europe, and they'd succeeded in murdering 6 million of them, which was more than 1/3 of the global Jewish population. Like any Jewish person, Ruby would have been all too aware of those unspeakable recent crimes. So if some of the visions he had in his jail cell sound lurid, we should remember that in some ways they accurately record the genuine horror show that had just taken place in Europe. None of this means that Ruby's delusions were not delusions, but it does help to explain why, when it came time for Ruby to go mad, this was the form his madness took. The other thing we need to remember here is that as an American Jew, Ruby had been forced to deal with a fairly high ambient level of anti-Semitism all his life.
Now, this fellow Rubenstein is a very shady character, has a bad record, street brawler, fighter, and that sort of thing.
That's J. Edgar Hoover talking to President Lyndon Johnson after Oswald's death, and insisting on referring to Ruby as Rubenstein, despite the fact that Ruby had legally changed his surname in 1947.
And in the place in Dallas, if a fellow came in there and couldn't pay his bill completely, Rubenstein would beat the very devil out of him and throw him out of the place. He was that kind of a fella.
You can hear the edge in Hoover's voice there. Maybe Ruby thought he could get away with calling himself Ruby instead of Rubenstein, but J. Edgar Hoover wasn't going to have it. Something similar happened during Ruby's trial. The indictment against him was entitled The State of Texas versus Jack Rubenstein, alias Jack Ruby. When D.A. Wade began reading the indictment out in court, Melvin Belli objected. He answers to the name Jack Ruby, he said. As Vincent Bugliosi points out in Reclaiming History, indicting Ruby under a name that he no longer went by was legally incorrect, which means that we have a right to wonder what the prosecution was playing at when it chose to do that. There's no question that Jack Ruby was tried and convicted in an anti-Semitic environment, and that he became the subject of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories after the assassination. And in that atmosphere, Ruby increasingly fell victim to obsessions and delusions that were a kind of mirror image of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. He may have been Jewish himself, but Jack Ruby was as morbidly obsessed with the theme of Jewish and anti-Jewish conspiracy as the average anti-Semite was.
Well, at the request of Jack Ruby, the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy has today conducted a polygraphic examination. The results, of course, are going to be taken to Washington, and there will be no disclosure of any sort until the Commission has analyzed the examination and come to its own conclusions.
That's a young attorney named Arlen Specter, speaking on July the 18th, 1964. Specter would later make himself famous and sometimes notorious as Pennsylvania's longest-serving US Senator. At the time he was speaking there, Specter was a 32-year-old lawyer working as a junior counsel to the Warren Commission, which was the commission of inquiry that President Lyndon Johnson set up to investigate the murders of Kennedy and J.D. Tippit, and the subsequent murder of Oswald by Ruby. Specter had come to Dallas to oversee a lie detector test that Jack Ruby had insisted on taking to clear himself of involvement in the president's murder, a test that Ruby passed, by the way. A month before he took that polygraph, Ruby had given his formal testimony to the Warren Commission in the sheriff's office of the Dallas County Jail. Various members of the commission and its legal staff travelled from Washington to Dallas that day to hear Ruby's testimony. Arlen Specter was among them, but because the sheriff's office was quite small, Specter wasn't considered important enough to make it into the room. There were too many other people there who were ahead of him in the pecking order. 2 members of the 7-man Warren Commission had come down to hear Ruby's testimony. One of them was Chief Justice Earl Warren himself, and the other was Gerald Ford, the future president, who was then a congressman. A couple of senior members of the commission's legal staff had to be fitted into the room too, along with Ruby's lawyer Joe Tonnehill. As a junior counsel, Specter didn't make the cut, so he went downstairs to watch a baseball game on TV while the others took Ruby's testimony. Before long, though, a Secret Service agent came down to tell Specter that he was now wanted upstairs. Specter was Jewish, and as the Secret Service agent bluntly told him, Ruby wants a Jew in the room. As Specter was about to find out, Ruby had been hammering the Jewish theme pretty hard during the early parts of his testimony. He'd told Earl Warren that the right-wing John Birch Society had been spreading rumours about him in Dallas. They were saying that Kennedy's murder had been a big Jewish conspiracy and Ruby was in on it. According to the transcript of his testimony, Ruby said, quote, "Through certain falsehoods said about me to other people, the John Birch Society, I am as good as guilty as the accused assassin of President Kennedy. I am used as a scapegoat. There is no greater weapon that you can use to create some falsehood about some of the Jewish faith, especially at the terrible, heinous crime such as the killing of President Kennedy." "I want to say this to you," Ruby said in another part of his testimony. "The Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment. Consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over our country, and I know I won't live to see you another time." This was the context in which Ruby made his request to be polygraphed. He begged Earl Warren to get him to Washington so he could take a lie detector test that would prove he'd had nothing to do with Kennedy's assassination. When he was asked why he had to go to Washington to take the test and why he couldn't just do it in Dallas, Ruby replied that Joe Tonnahill, his lawyer, was refusing to let him be polygraphed. Tonnahill was sitting right next to Ruby when he said that, but he let the claim slide because by now he was quite used to hearing Ruby say such stuff. When Earl Warren asked Ruby if he had any proof that the John Birch Society was spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about him, Ruby said he didn't. He said it was, quote, "just a feeling." So this was the kind of mood Ruby was in when he made his request to have, quote, "a Jew in the room," and when Arlen Specter was fetched from downstairs to fulfill that request. As soon as Specter came into the room, Ruby started staring at him and refusing to look away. Specter found this disconcerting, especially when Ruby began mouthing a silent question at him over and over. As Specter recalled in his book Passion for Truth, the phrase that Ruby kept mouthing at him was, "Are you a Yid?" Specter knew better than to offer any kind of response because he knew that anything he said would show up in the official transcript. Finally, Ruby's patience ran out. He jumped up out of his chair and pulled Specter aside into a corner of the room, and he asked Earl Warren to come over and join them. When one of the Commission's senior attorneys tried to join the huddle too, Ruby asked him if he was Jewish. When he said he wasn't, Ruby told him to go away. Ruby then proceeded to tell Specter and Warren that American Jews were being, quote, "tortured and mutilated because of his perceived involvement in Kennedy's assassination." "Chief, you've got to get me to Washington," Ruby said to Warren. "They're cutting off the arms and legs of Jewish children in Albuquerque and El Paso." Apparently what Ruby was saying in the corner was loud enough for everyone else in the room to hear it too, because Joe Tonnahill now scribbled a note on a piece of paper and handed it to Gerald Ford. The note said, "You see, I told you he was crazy." Jack Ruby saw Tonnahill pass this note to Ford and he demanded to see it, but when he read it, the contents didn't seem to bother him. He just crumpled the note up and threw it away. Considering the things Ruby was saying in that room, it's hard to argue that Tonnahill's note was factually wrong. By the time Ruby gave his testimony to the Warren Commission, he clearly was a sick man, as Melvin Belli had always said. The only question that lingers is whether a man who was this far gone in June 1964 could possibly have been completely sane 7 months earlier when he shot Oswald. By the way, if there's something about Ruby's urgent request to be taken to Washington that rings a bell with you, it's probably because conspiracy theorists have spent years talking up the fact that Ruby made this request, while always forgetting to mention the fact that he was plainly off his rocker when he made it. Oliver Stone makes a big deal out of Ruby's Washington request in the movie JFK, for example, during a scene that quite shamefully misrepresents what happened when Ruby testified to the Warren Commission. Stone's version of Jack Ruby is played by Brian Doyle Murray, and his version of Earl Warren is played in a grotesque cameo by Jim Garrison himself, that is, by the same real-life crusading DA and alleged hero that Kevin Costner portrays in the movie. The way Stone spins Ruby's Warren Commission testimony, Ruby is perfectly sane, and he knows all the hard facts about Kennedy's assassination. He wants to get to Washington because he wants to blow the lid off the Kennedy conspiracy, and he can't do that in Dallas because his life is in real danger there from actually existing conspirators. And of course, Stone's version of Earl Warren is desperate to keep the lid on the Kennedy conspiracy, so he flat out refuses to let Ruby go to Washington. The whole scene is typical of the way Stone's movie treats the historical record as if it's a piece of plasticine that can be endlessly tweaked and reshaped until it conforms to Oliver Stone's conspiratorial fantasies. In real life, Ruby desperately and repeatedly maintained that he hadn't been involved in Kennedy's murder and knew absolutely nothing about any conspiracy to kill him. That's why he wanted to go to Washington, so he could take a lie detector test that would prove he had zero knowledge of or involvement in any kind of conspiracy. If they found out I was telling the truth, he told Earl Warren in real life, maybe my people won't be tortured or mutilated. And in real life, the Warren Commission didn't stand in the way of Ruby's request to be polygraphed, although he took the test in Dallas rather than in Washington because there was no sane reason to take him all the way to Washington to do a polygraph test. The polygraph examiner asked Ruby questions like, did you assist Oswald in the assassination? And did you shoot Oswald in order to silence him? Ruby answered no to both those questions and to all other similar questions, and he passed the test. I've said a few times in this podcast that conspiracy theorists have a way of turning reality upside down. And Oliver Stone's reinvention of Jack Ruby's Warren Commission testimony is a perfect illustration of what I mean by that. Stone's scene is a paranoid and completely upside-down misrepresentation of what actually happened. The main fact that Stone flips on its head is the fact that Ruby was palpably insane when he gave his Warren Commission testimony. He was a desperately ill man sitting in a room full of sane men who were doing their best to humour him. In Stone's movie, it's exactly the other way round. Ruby is the sanest and most decent man in the room, and he knows real objective secrets that everybody else in the room is desperate to stop him from divulging. This is a grotesque rewriting of history, but considering the size of the lie Stone tells in this scene, it's interesting that the tricks he uses to tell it are quite small and subtle. It's not like he ignores the historical record altogether or makes up things that Jack Ruby never said. In fact, a lot of the dialogue in Stone's scene is lifted word for word from the transcript of Ruby's Warren Commission testimony. All Stone does is leave out just a few key lines, and by leaving them out he manages to completely alter the meaning of the lines that he does quote. For example, in real life, Ruby said, "The Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment. Consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over the country, and I know I won't live to see you another time." In Stone's version of the scene, Ruby's reference to the extermination of the Jewish people magically disappears. Stone's version of Ruby says, "If I'm eliminated, there won't be any way of knowing any bit of the truth pertaining to my situation, and consequently a whole new form of government is going to take over this country, and I know I won't live to see you some other time." I don't happen to think Oliver Stone is all that smart, but he can't possibly not have known what he was doing when he left out all the bits of Ruby's testimony where he talked about the vast anti-Semitic conspiracy that was mutilating and murdering his people at that very moment. By snipping out those parts of Ruby's testimony, but leaving in his claim that a whole new form of government was taking over the country, Stone gives it the impression that Ruby was making a realistic political claim there, instead of giving voice to a tragic private delusion. Stone himself believed that Kennedy's murder had been carried out by a cabal of military industrial-style political conspirators, and his bastardized version of Ruby's Warren Commission testimony makes it sound as if Ruby believed that too. And the worst thing is, I suspect that Stone believed he was being morally correct when he travestied the evidence in this way. After all, Stone was thoroughly convinced that his theories about the case were right, and since they were right, it could hardly be wrong to tweak and improve the evidence so that it illustrated his theories just a bit more neatly than it might superficially appear to. But if Stone had to lean on the ramblings of an obviously delusional man to make his case, and if he couldn't even afford to quote those ramblings accurately, he probably should have taken that as a sign that his own case was inaccurate and delusional too. The massive political conspiracy believed in by people like Stone sounds kind of plausible, but on inspection it's no more evidence-based than the bomb-dropping, limb-lopping, oil-boiling religious conspiracy believed in by Jack Ruby. I've talked about this scene in JFK in so much detail because I think it's important for us to understand how completely without merit and substance the arguments are that people like Oliver Stone have been using for 60 years to keep the idea of a Kennedy conspiracy in play. If you've only followed this case from a distance, you could be forgiven for assuming that there must be some substance to the claims that people like Stone have made in their films and their books. But in Stone's case, there's not only no there, there's active distortion of the evidence there. Stone is a straight-up con artist who knowingly misquotes his sources. To be fair to other conspiracy theorists, most of them are nowhere near as brazenly unscrupulous as Oliver Stone is. Most conspiracy theorists are honestly mistaken. They really do believe that the evidence is on their side. But the fact remains that it isn't. The difference between Stone and the average conspiracy theorist is that while Stone consciously distorts the evidence, most conspiracy theorists distort the evidence unconsciously by being honestly unable to see it straight. Stone knows he's deceiving us. Other conspiracy theorists deceive themselves first before they go about deceiving us. But the upshot is the same. Their works are still deceptive. When you look at any work of Kennedy conspiracism up close, it always turns out to be as full of holes as Stone's JFK is. But it's a depressing fact that the sheer volume of these failed works has made Kennedy conspiracism succeed in a cumulative way. It's been successful in the same way that a mudslide is successful. Each individual book and film has turned out to be worthless in its own right, but the fact that there have been so many of them has created a general feeling that there must be something to the conspiratorial idea. So I have no doubt that although I've now spent about 3 hours showing you that there was nothing fishy about Ruby's murder of Oswald, and that all the fishy stuff has gone on in the work of mountebanks like Oliver Stone, I have no doubt that at some level you'll still probably feel that there was something indefinably fishy about what happened. It's very hard to rise above this superstition because it's become ingrained. The culture has spent 60 years telling us to believe it. You do sometimes feel like you're fighting an uphill battle when you try to talk rationally about the Kennedy assassination, but that's no reason not to keep trying. Although I'm almost done with Jack Ruby now, there's one question about him that we still haven't quite closed the loop on. Melvin Belli said that Ruby was a sick man, and we've seen that this was unquestionably true of Ruby after he shot Oswald. But is there evidence to suggest that he was already sick or was getting sick when he shot Oswald? Even the professionals don't seem to be able to give us a definitive answer to this question. A forensic psychologist who studied Ruby's case once wrote, "If he was not insane at the start of his trial, he certainly was by the time it finished. The paradox is that while the jury rejected the insanity defense, Ruby was already psychotic. Awaiting his appeal in jail, Ruby's mental state continued to deteriorate. It was evident to all that he was grossly delusional." So if even the experts can't be sure whether or not Ruby was mentally ill when he shot Oswald, I'm not going to be able to give you a definitive answer on that either. But I do think that there are some interesting signs that Ruby was already starting to unravel when he shot Oswald. Although his obsession with the theme of Jewish persecution didn't descend into full-blown psychosis until he was in jail, if we follow the thread of that obsession backwards, we'll see that it was at least mildly present in Ruby's head before he shot Oswald, and that it began to intensify in some quite alarming ways in the days and hours before the crime. Back in the first episode of this podcast, I mentioned a creepy full-page advertisement that appeared in the Dallas Morning News on the day of Kennedy's assassination. The ad began with the bold headline, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas." And it went on to accuse Kennedy of a variety of political sins, including the cardinal sin of being soft on communism. The whole ad had a sinister and threatening air to it because it was printed inside a thick black border that made it look like a death notice. When Kennedy landed in Dallas that morning, one of his aides showed him the ad, and Kennedy said, "Can you imagine a newspaper doing a thing like that?" And then he said to his wife, "We're heading into nut country today." Jack Ruby happened to notice this ad too on the morning of the assassination. He found it appallingly unpatriotic, and he feared that it reflected very badly on the city of Dallas. But the part of the ad that troubled Ruby the most, and quickly came to obsess him, was the 4 lines of text right at the bottom, which revealed that the ad had been paid for by, quote, "the American Fact-Finding Committee, Bernard Weissman, Chairman." Weissman was a Jewish-sounding name, and Ruby found that deeply troubling. In the hours before Kennedy's assassination, Ruby got increasingly hot under the collar about the Weissman ad. He rang up the Dallas Morning News and chewed them out for having printed it. "Where the hell do you get off taking an ad like that?" he said. He also rang the Dallas Times-Herald and discovered that somebody had tried to place the ad there as well, but that paper had had the good sense to turn it down. If this Weissman is a Jew, Ruby told his sister, somebody ought to whack the hell out of him. But Ruby was inclined to believe that Weissman wasn't real and that the ad had been placed by somebody using a fake name. He told people that the whole thing had probably been concocted by a communist who was out to discredit the Jews. When Kennedy was shot at 12:30 that afternoon, Ruby's fixation on the Weissman ad intensified. He cut the ad out of the paper and carried the clipping round in his pocket and kept showing it to people he ran into. "This son of a bitch is trying to put the blame for the assassination on the Jews," he said. A friend of Ruby's said that he'd never seen Jack quite so upset as he was by the Weissman ad. Ruby started digging round to see if he could find out if Weissman really existed. Even after he shot Oswald on the Sunday morning, Ruby was still obsessing on the Weissman issue. He told an FBI agent who interviewed him after Oswald's murder, "I'm proud that I'm a Jew and ashamed that anyone named Weissman would criticize the president." Although Ruby never did get to the bottom of the matter, it later turned out that Bernard Weissman was indeed a real person and was indeed Jewish. He was a 26-year-old salesman who had done military service in Germany and had become interested in right-wing politics after returning to America. He'd considered joining the John Birch Society in Dallas, but he'd been put off by the society's rampant anti-Semitism, although he did continue to rub shoulders with a few individual Birches. It was the John Birch Society that wrote the text of the blackboarded ad and that stumped up the $1,500 it would cost to place it. But it was Weissman who took the cash down to the office of the Dallas Morning News and formally authorized the ad. After Kennedy's assassination, Weissman fled Dallas without too much delay because he was terrified that his involvement in the sinister ad would make people believe that he'd been involved in Kennedy's death. But Jack Ruby knew none of that on the day of the Kennedy assassination. As far as he was concerned, the Weissman ad was still a dark and vexing mystery. And as Ruby was driving around Dallas late that night or in the small hours of the next morning, he saw something else that vexed him even more. He saw a billboard that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." At the time, Ruby didn't know exactly who Earl Warren was, much less that he'd be meeting him in the flesh just 6 months later. All Ruby knew was that Warren was somehow associated with the government. Even at the best of times, the "Impeach Earl Warren" billboard would have offended Ruby's sense of patriotism, but on the night of Kennedy's murder, he found it downright sinister, like the Wiseman ad. Once again, Ruby theorized that either the John Birch Society or the Communists must be responsible. At around 4:30 in the morning on the day after the assassination, Ruby arrived back at his apartment in an agitated state, and he woke up George Senator to tell him all about the heinous billboard. Senator was groggy, but Ruby convinced him to get out of bed and drive back into Dallas with him in the dark so they could take a photo of the billboard. On the way into town, they picked up another sidekick of Ruby's who had a Polaroid camera and some flashbulbs. Unfortunately, Ruby couldn't remember exactly where he'd seen the billboard, so the three men had to drive around looking for it until the sun came up. When they finally found it, Ruby's sidekick took 3 Polaroids of it, and Ruby carried one of these round with him for the rest of the day, along with his clipping of the Wiseman ad. He was working on a theory that the poster and the ad were connected, not just with each other, but with Oswald and the assassination. "I don't know why I want to connect them with Oswald," Ruby told a friend, "but I do." Ruby seemed to be very incoherent, one of his friends said later. Ruby felt sure that he'd stumbled on the secret of the Kennedy assassination, and he wanted to pass on his discoveries to the right people. He told his friends that he planned to get in touch with the FBI on Monday morning. "I thought my brother Jack was plain nuts," was his sister's verdict on Ruby's assassination theory. Whether he was nuts or not, Ruby was doing what hundreds of thousands of other people were doing that day in Dallas, and indeed all around the world. He was telling himself stories that seemed to make sense of Kennedy's senseless death. He was listening for signals in the noise. He was seeing connections that weren't really there. In short, he was being a conspiracy theorist. One curious thing about both Ruby and Oswald is that before other people started having conspiracy theories about them, both men were conspiracy theorists in their own right. Oswald was a Marxist, and Marxism is a conspiracy theory of society, as the philosopher Karl Popper said. And Ruby was an even more obvious conspiracy theorist than Oswald was. It would be pushing it to say that the conspiracy theories that Oswald and Ruby believed in directly caused their respective crimes, but in both cases, conspiracy theory didn't help matters. It never does. Ruby and Oswald both had unhealthy personalities. Their conspiracy theories were a kind of natural extension of paranoid tendencies that they were born with. But those conspiracy theories also helped to exacerbate those dangerous tendencies. Conspiracy theorists scoff at Ruby's claim that he shot Oswald because he wanted to show the world that a Jew had guts. They think that that is a preposterously shallow reason to shoot somebody, so they dismiss it as an obvious cover story. But we've seen ample evidence now that Ruby's feelings about his Jewish identity were far from shallow. They eventually swelled into an all-consuming obsession, and I think it would be rash to claim that this mounting obsession had nothing to do with Ruby's urge to shoot Oswald. As we saw in the last episode, before Ruby left his apartment on the morning of the crime, he spent about 10 minutes pacing round the place, muttering to himself. He had this look in his eyes which didn't look good, George Senator said, and his lips were going. What he was jabbering about, I don't know, but he was really pacing. Was it possible that the Wiseman ad was part of what Ruby was jabbering about? We'll never know for sure, But we do know that after Ruby's arrest, 2 copies of the Weizmann ad were found in his car. His own copy, plus the copy that he'd clipped out of his sister's paper. And he was certainly jabbering about Weizmann a few hours after his arrest when he told that FBI agent, "I'm proud that I'm a Jew and ashamed that anyone called Weizmann would criticize the president." Ruby's life was sad and sordid, and his death was too. In December 1966, he was in jail waiting for the date of his new trial to be set when he fell ill with what seemed to be pneumonia. Scans revealed that his body was riddled with cancer. The disease had started in his lungs but had spread to his brain, liver, ribs, vertebrae, and pancreas. He died just a month later, on January the 3rd, 1967. The pathologist who did Ruby's autopsy found 8 tumours in his brain, the largest of which had a diameter of 3/4 of an inch. The pathologist thought it unlikely that any of these tumours had been present in Ruby's brain when he shot Oswald, but he couldn't rule that out definitively. Since nothing is sacred to conspiracy theorists, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a popular conspiracy theory about Ruby's terminal cancer, which has it that a mysterious doctor injected Ruby with so-called cancer cells while he was locked up in the county jail. In his book Crossfire, the author Jim Mars quotes a sheriff's deputy who claims to have heard this story from Ruby himself. And to be fair, it does sound like the kind of thing that Ruby might have said during the delirious last phase of his life. But even if he did say it, he obviously wasn't suggesting what conspiracy theorists like Jim Mars think he was suggesting. People like Mars imagine that Ruby was injected with these so-called cancer cells to stop him from revealing all the secrets he knew about the assassination. But even after he'd gone mad, Ruby never stopped maintaining that he didn't know any secrets about the assassination. He took 2 successful lie detector tests to establish that point, and in his hospital bed a week before he died, he was frantically trying to arrange a 3rd. "There is nothing to hide," he said on his deathbed. "There was no one else." More to the point, although it is vaguely plausible that Ruby said he'd been injected with cancer cells, it certainly isn't plausible that he was. You don't need to know anything about cell biology to know that. You only need to have common sense. If the bad guys were so desperate to kill Ruby that they went to the trouble of giving him a lethal injection in his cell, why didn't they inject him with something that killed him straight away, instead of infusing him with a slow-acting poison that would give him several more months to spill the conspiratorial beans? And speaking of slow-acting, why did these assassins wait until late 1966, some 3 years after Kennedy's assassination, to get the ball rolling on Ruby's carcinogenic elimination? If you Google the words Ruby and cancer together, you'll soon run into online geniuses who ask rhetorical questions like, and I quote, "How come Jack Ruby just suddenly got cancer after shooting Oswald?" But Ruby was diagnosed with cancer 3 years after shooting Oswald. At the risk of stating the obvious, anyone who wanted to silence him would have silenced him a lot earlier, before he'd had a chance to stand trial and testify to the Warren Commission and give more newspaper interviews and press conferences than you could shake a stick at. But for conspiracy theorists, it's an article of faith that people like Ruby never die of disease or natural causes. When someone like Ruby dies, it's because he was murdered. And since he was murdered, that pretty much confirms that he must have been right on the brink of revealing something truly sensational. This is what I mean when I say that conspiracy theorists see the world through a distorting lens. In their eyes, a middle-aged man dying from cancer is explosive proof of a conspiracy. As usual, we can rely on Oliver Stone to illustrate this point in the most vividly absurd way. When Stone was making JFK, He filmed a sequence in which Brian Doyle Murray, as Ruby, is shown receiving a cancer injection in his right butt cheek. The scene didn't make it into the final movie. Stone couldn't even find room for it in his 3-hour and 25-minute director's cut. But you can watch a rough cut of the scene in the deleted scenes section of the Blu-ray. When the doctor enters Ruby's cell and breaks out his sinister-looking syringe, Ruby exclaims, "For Christ's sakes, what the hell kind of needle is that? Shit, Doc, I've got the flu. I don't need any shot. I'm telling you, I don't want or need no shot." But despite his reservations, Ruby grimly bends over and the shadowy doctor injects a hot jet of cancer cells into his bare butt. Oliver Stone admits on his audio commentary that this, quote, potential murder scenario has been perhaps crudely dramatised, but at least it's a breakthrough, he adds. Although I must say he does sound unusually sheepish when he says that. But to his credit, Stone does then take a stab at explaining why somebody would have suddenly decided to infect Ruby with cancer some 3 years after the Kennedy assassination. Ruby had just been granted a retrial, Stone explains. This sentence at least does sound like it might be true, or it would if you didn't know who you were dealing with. When you drill down on what Stone says there, the usual thing happens. What he says falls apart like an old biscuit, and your drill is left spinning around in a pile of loose crumbs. Stone's only source for the claim that Ruby was injected with cancer cells is Jim Mars's Crossfire, which Stone bought the rights to when he was writing his screenplay. But if you go to Mars's book, you find that Mars is quite foggy on the question of when this supposed cancer injection supposedly occurred. At no point does he claim that this imaginary event happened after Ruby was granted a retrial. In fact, he seems to imply that it happened in August or September of 1966, and Ruby wasn't granted a retrial until October. Apart from Oliver Stone's complete inability to cite any piece of information, even a dodgy piece of information, without reimagining it in his own favour, you also have to wonder what makes him so sure that Ruby's retrial would have been earth-shattering. So earth-shattering that Ruby had to be bumped off before it could happen. Stone seems to forget what the word retrial means. It means that Ruby had been tried once before, and during that trial, not a shred of evidence had come out to show that Ruby had been involved in any kind of conspiracy. From the conspiratorial angle, Ruby's first trial had been a complete nothing burger, and yet for some reason Stone takes it for granted that the retrial would have been huge. All the evidence that people like him have wet dreams about would finally have come out at the retrial, if only Ruby hadn't suddenly died. In a way, you've got to admire the eternal optimism of the Kennedy conspiracists. No evidence that's come out in the past has come close to vindicating their beliefs, and yet for some reason they're serenely sure that this evidence would have come out if only reality had happened just a bit differently. They know that the proof exists, it just hasn't been allowed out of the bag yet. And they still haven't lost hope that it will come out one day in the future, when this or that CIA file finally gets declassified. Nothing can falsify the beliefs of people like Stone. Nothing that happens in reality, or that fails to happen in reality, can be disappointing enough to make them throw in the towel. There's one final thing that's wrong with Stone's claim that Ruby was murdered before his retrial, and this thing is so large and so preposterous that you can almost miss it unless you step back and take a moment to think about what Stone's saying. He's saying that Jack Ruby had to be silenced before he could spill the beans. But that's exactly the same thing that people said about Oswald. And wasn't Jack Ruby meant to have been the ice-cold assassin who was brought in to do the silencing? Wasn't that the whole point of Ruby? Wasn't he meant to have been the sinister wet boy who took Oswald out before he could talk? Ruby must have been a pretty pointless and half-assed hitman if he then had to be eliminated too by having cancer cells injected into his buttock, which, come to think of it, is the very definition of a half-assed measure. There's a kind of glorious cosmic irony in Oliver Stone's belief that Jack Ruby, the original hitman, was silenced by another hitman in his turn. It's like the infinite regress that comes up when people tell you that the universe is so complex that it must have had a creator. By that creationist logic, the creator must have had a creator too, and so must the creator of the creator. What people like Stone give us without realizing it is the infinitely regressing hitman thesis, where the first hitman has to be silenced by a second hitman, who then has to be silenced by a third. As far as I know, Oliver Stone has never come up with a theory about what happened to the doctor who injected those cancer cells into Ruby's backside, but by Stone's logic, that guy would have had to spend the rest of his short life watching his back, or perhaps quite literally, watching his ass. We're now 6 episodes into this podcast, and as I wrap up this episode on Jack Ruby and his motives, that means that the first phase of the podcast has come to an end. At this point, I've done my best to set up a kind of factual base camp at the edge of the jungle of Kennedy conspiracy theory. I've done my best to describe and prove what I think happened in Dallas. I've presented all the evidence that makes me believe that both Oswald and Ruby acted alone. What I don't claim to have done is prove that there was no conspiracy. As experts in logic will tell you, it's very hard to prove a negative. Things that don't exist, or that didn't happen, don't tend to leave behind proof of their non-being. It's up to the people who do believe in a Kennedy conspiracy to describe exactly what they think happened and to prove that it did. And that shouldn't be hard for them to do if what they believe happened actually did. So from this point on in the podcast, we'll be turning to the story of conspiracy theory itself and to the specific claims that it has made. Who were the pioneers of Kennedy conspiracism? Why did their books and lectures and TV appearances cause such a stir? What was it about the early evidence in this case that made so many people, including many quite rational people, believe that a conspiracy had occurred? Surely there must have been some good reason to believe that, at least in the early days. And in fact, there was. In the early days of this case, America's official agencies made an incredible series of blunders that fatally distorted the public's understanding of Kennedy's murder. Those early mistakes put a cloud of confusion over this case that has never really gone away. Because when you put those early mistakes together, they seemed to point to one unavoidable conclusion. Oswald couldn't possibly have acted alone. There had to have been a second gunman in Dealey Plaza.
Do you feel that someone else other than Oswald did shoot President Kennedy?
I believe that if everything that the FBI, Dallas Police, Dallas DA version says is true, that is, that one person alone participated in the assassination, and that Oswald was on the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository building, that it would have been virtually impossible for Oswald to have been the one person, because I think it is quite plain that the shots that were, some of the shots, or at least one of the shots that was fired, which struck the president, was fired from in front of the president, not from the rear.